Let me back up a sec. Imagine sitting at a table in a restaurant you secretly own, dressed down in an old hoodie and work boots, nobody recognizing you, and suddenly a napkin lands in front of you like a live grenade. 12 words, scrawled in frantic handwriting. They call you the N-word in the kitchen. They just poisoned your meal. Those words didn't just kill your appetite, they split the whole room open, turned fine dining into a crime scene in one breath. Yeah, that happened. And for a guy like Julian Vance, a man who survived Wall Street sharks, grown a $10 billion empire from nothing but grit and red Georgia dirt, this hit different because it wasn't business, it was personal, and you could feel it in the pit of your stomach. Julian wasn't there for the food. He was there for the truth. Undercover, anonymous, trying to see his own empire from the ground up because rumors of something ugly had been climbing up to his penthouse office in Atlanta. Emails about racism, humiliation, employees treated like ghosts, customers like dirt. The veranda, the gem of his restaurant portfolio in Savannah, was supposed to be a crown jewel, but now it looked more like a snake pit. So Julian walked in alone, no suits, no security, just a man hunting for rot in his own house. And it didn't take long to smell it. The hostess looked at him like he was garbage, dumped him at a wobbly table by the kitchen doors, ignored him for 17 minutes, made sure every gesture screamed, "You don't belong here." And then came Sarah. You could see her spirit written all over her face. Tired but unbroken, her name tag crooked, her shoes worn through. She dropped that napkin on his table without a word, eyes full of fierce dignity, just pure, desperate courage. Not asking for help, just dropping the truth like a match in a room full of gasoline. In that moment, it wasn't about food or money or reputation. It was about what you do when you see the worst of people and refuse to stay quiet. It was about raw, terrifying justice. Now, Julian's not a man who believes in luck. He's all about data and discipline, the power of keeping control. But that night, every lesson he'd learned growing up, the way his granddad would work himself half to death just to keep food on the table, the years Julian spent learning to code on a broken pawn shop laptop, every scrap of self-worth he'd had to build in a world that looked down on guys like him, all of it boiled up inside him. This was a fight he couldn't outsource, a disease he had to cut out with his own hands. The veranda was a palace built on old money and older prejudice, paintings of slave owners on the walls, gas lamps, Southern gentility, the whole 9 yards. You could taste the hierarchy in the air, see it in the faces of customers and staff. Sarah was the only black waitress in a staff of 30, shuffled to the worst shifts, spoken to like she was barely human, watching her tips vanish while something broke loose inside her. She didn't cry or scream. She wrote the truth, folded it into a napkin, and delivered it straight to Julian. She risked everything. Her job, her paycheck, her future. But sometimes you get tired of being a ghost. Julian read the message, felt a wave of icy fury run through him. He didn't make a scene. He played it cold, stood up, and told the manager he wanted a word in private. You know that moment when someone switches from nobody to king in a blink? That was it. Harrington, the manager, tried to bluff, but Julian wasn't having it. "Show me the kitchen." "Cameras," he demanded. And just like that, the power dynamic flipped. Harrington fumbled, made excuses, but the evidence was gone. Footage wiped, just like the napkin warned. But here's where the story twists. Julian wasn't just some rich guy with a grudge. He had his own team, his own playbook. In minutes, he called in his security chief, got backup copies from the cloud, secured the footage, locked down every detail. That night, in his hotel suite, Julian watched everything. Weeks of footage showing not just what happened to him, but to others. Families humiliated, food deliberately sabotaged, laughter over cruelty. It wasn't a one-off. It was the culture, and it was all on tape. By morning, the veranda wasn't a restaurant. It was a crime scene. The FBI showed up. Handcuffs clicked, and the rotten heart of the place was ripped out. Harrington, Du Bois, all the enablers, gone. The rest of the staff left standing in shock, some angry, some relieved, some quietly triumphant. Sarah came in for her shift, sure she'd be fired, but found Julian waiting for her, no longer undercover, but in a suit, radiating a kind of power you could feel in your bones. And here's the second twist. Julian didn't just thank her. He gave her a choice. Walk away, get a check big enough to wipe out her debts and finish her dreams, or stay and help him rebuild everything. Make the veranda a place that served dignity, not just food. You already trusted me with your life, he told her. This is the easy part. And for the first time in years, Sarah could breathe. She took the job. Director of Culture and Community Engagement. A real job, real authority, a real shot at changing the world around her. What happened next was nothing short of a revolution. The restaurant was gutted, the old portraits taken down, new staff brought in from every walk of life. Bias training, anonymous reporting, a new chef who believed in people, not just plates. Sarah wasn't just working for a paycheck. She was building hope, and the city started to notice. People reached out, shared their own stories, and suddenly, what started as a napkin became a movement. Julian stood on the steps of the shuttered restaurant, reporters crowding in, and owned up to everything. No excuses, no corporate spin. The darkness ends today, he said, and introduced Sarah as the future. The veranda would reopen, but only when it was ready to serve everyone with respect and justice. The place that once symbolized exclusion was now a beacon for something better. Here's the real kicker. None of it started with a riot, or a lawsuit, or a boardroom showdown. It started with 12 words on a napkin and a waitress who'd had enough. That's how change happens, you know what I mean? Sometimes, the most heroic thing you can do is just tell the truth, even when your hands are shaking. So what about you? What injustice have you witnessed and ignored? What poison did you see served and choose not to speak up about? What might change in your world if you finally wrote your own napkin? If this story struck a nerve, hit like. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop your thoughts below. What's the biggest act of courage you've ever witnessed, or maybe wish you'd taken? Because history shows, revolutions don't always start with an explosion. Sometimes, they start with a whisper. Sometimes, all it takes is a napkin and the guts to tell the truth. Funny thing about courage, it doesn't always feel like fireworks or thunder. Most times it's a knot in your stomach and a voice in your head whispering, "Don't look away." For Sarah Jenkins, that whisper had turned into a roar. Suddenly, she wasn't invisible anymore. She was the reason the whole city was talking, the reason a monument to old money and old habits was coming down, brick by brick. But you know how life is, right? Change doesn't just roll out a red carpet, even when the whole world's watching. In the weeks after that explosive press conference, Sarah felt like she was living someone else's life. Some days her hands still shook opening the door, afraid she'd find angry protesters, or, worse, the quiet old guard waiting to freeze her out. Instead, the veranda was a beehive, contractors ripping out everything rotten, chefs and managers interviewing in circles, reporters lurking outside, trying to get a shot of the whistleblower waitress. Yeah, they called her that, like she was a headline instead of a real person who still had to figure out what to do with the rest of her life. Julian Vance didn't disappear, either. He was there every day, sleeves rolled up, clipboard in hand, more like a coach than a CEO, stopping by Sarah's new office with a cup of coffee and a question. How does it feel? Some days she'd answer honestly, terrified, overwhelmed, like a fraud who'd just been handed the keys to a kingdom she'd barely survived. Other days, when the team sat in a circle, no podium, no speeches, just raw stories pouring out, she could almost believe it was working. She listened to dishwashers, line cooks, even a couple servers who used to side-eye her, and realized just how deep the rot had gone. But she also saw something else, a flicker of hope, people showing up early, asking questions, not just about their schedules, but about how they could do better, be better. One afternoon, a young busboy named Louise cornered her by the walk-in fridge, voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Jenkins, thank you. For all of us." She almost laughed, like she'd done something magical, when all she'd really done was write the truth down and hope someone would listen. But maybe that's what real change is, 1,000 quiet voices finally believing they matter. Rebuilding wasn't easy. There were plenty of old-timers who quit, others who dragged their feet, and every day brought a new challenge. Angry emails from former customers who claimed tradition was under attack, social media trolls calling it a publicity stunt. But Sarah learned to tune it out, to focus on the ones who stayed, the ones who dared to come back. With Julian's blessing, She overhauled the hiring process, brought in people who knew struggle, who had stories, who didn't need reminding that dignity wasn't a luxury. She hired an older woman named Gloria, who'd spent 20 years working 3 jobs to keep her kids in school, a college kid named Marcus who'd grown up in foster care, a cook from New Orleans who could turn grits into a religious experience and believed a kitchen should feel like family. And every night, after the dust settled and the last contractor left, Sarah would sit in her office and scroll through messages from people she'd never met, servers from other restaurants, kids from her old neighborhood, even a couple of the old veranda regulars, all sharing stories about what they'd seen, what they'd swallowed, what they wished they'd said. Sometimes she'd cry. Sometimes she'd just stare out at the city and wonder if this was all really happening. But mostly, she felt something new, a quiet kind of power, the kind that comes from standing up when it would have been so much easier to sit down. Julian wasn't done, either. He poured money into training, scholarships, new equipment, even started a mentorship program so every kid working their first shift got a shot at something bigger. Nobody gets left behind, he'd say, his voice that deep rumble. You couldn't help but trust. When the veranda finally reopened, there were no velvet ropes, no exclusive guest list, just a sign on the door, everyone welcome. Word got around quick, lines formed down the block, people curious to see if a restaurant could really change its soul. Opening night wasn't perfect. The AC broke, the new chef burned a batch of biscuits, and the local news crew tried to catch someone slipping. But Sarah stood at the center of it all, watching regulars and strangers sharing tables, staff greeting customers by name, laughter echoing where silence used to live. She felt her heart settle for the first time in a long while. A few days later, she spotted Mr. Harrington, her old manager, lurking on the sidewalk, trying to look casual. She met his eyes, expecting bitterness, but all she saw was shame and something like regret. He didn't say a word, just turned and walked away, swallowed by the crowd. Sarah wondered if he'd ever really understood what happened, if he'd ever find a way to make peace with the choices he'd made. She hoped he would. She hoped they all would. But the world keeps spinning, right? The press moved on to the next scandal. The old money crowd found a new clubhouse, and Sarah kept her head down, doing the work. Some nights, after a long shift, she'd sit in the empty dining room with Julian, trading stories, him about boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, her about tableside heartbreaks and tiny triumphs. They laughed a lot, sometimes at the absurdity of it all, sometimes just at themselves. You know what I mean? Julian would say, grinning, and for the first time in her life, Sarah didn't feel like she had to explain. Now, a year later, the veranda is unrecognizable. The food's still fancy. The building's still grand, but the spirit's different. A place where nobody has to hide who they are, where the only thing not on the menu is silence. Sarah's finishing her degree at night, mentoring new hires by day, living proof that sometimes all it takes is one person saying enough for 100 others to find their voice. And every now and then, she pulls that napkin out of her desk, creases soft, ink faded, but the words still burning. A reminder of what it costs to stand up and what's possible when you do. So let me ask you again, what's the truth you've been carrying? Waiting for the right moment to say out loud? Who's the person you're hoping will listen? Because maybe, just maybe, the world is ready to hear it. And if this story made you feel something, if it got under your skin, if it made you see your own life a little different, don't just scroll past. Share your story in the comments. Start a conversation that matters. Hit like, hit subscribe if you want more. The next revolution might just start with you.